And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Fiji on behalf of Pacific Islands Forum, His Excellency Satyendra Prasad, the permanent representative to the United Nations. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. Madam Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delivering this statement on behalf also of Fiji's Minister, Honorable Rosie Akbar, who is unable to join us due to unforeseen circumstances. Bula Vinaka, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of 18 member states of the Pacific Island Forum, acting as one blue Pacific continent and stewards of over 40 million square kilometers of the Pacific Ocean, the world's largest, most abundant ocean, with its many islands and rich, diverse cultures and people. We are developing the 2050 strategy for Blue Pacific continent, asserting the Pacific Island Forum's centrality in shaping the destiny of our region. Excellencies, we join the international community in raising our concerns for the millions of women and children being displaced by the war in Ukraine and exposed to violence and abuse today. This theme for CSW66 is critical to the Pacific. While COVID-19 is our immediate crisis, climate change persists as the single gravest threat to the livelihood, security, and well-being of the Pacific peoples. Pacific Island Forum leaders have expressed grave concerns for our collective future as global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. The shared prosperity, security of Blue Pacific can only exist if we pursue efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Science is not negotiable. Urgent action by international community to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is critical to keep us on the 1.5 pathway. Equal and full participation of all women and girls must be central to global action. Our region, Excellencies, has contributed least to global warming and yet impacted most by climate change. 5 out of 15 countries most at risk of disasters in the world are in the Pacific. Weather-related events are more extreme and more intense. The recent volcanic eruptions in Tonga caused ashfall, tsunami, severe damage to livelihoods, telecommunications. It altered the geographical landscape and affected the blue continent and well beyond. Our people continue to fight. I'm proud to say Pacific women and girls in their diversity continue to play a critical role in building resilient communities. Recognizing women and girls' knowledge, capabilities, their skills, and empowering them is vital to safety and security of all Pacific families. Our Pacific Forum leaders have taken a strong stance on climate change, disaster resilience, and environment through milestone regional agreements and frameworks which highlight the threat of climate change presents, the need for an integrated approach, and for more urgent global action. The Pacific has demonstrated strong leadership in calling for urgent action on oceans and the adoption of SDG 14. The potential of the ocean to meet sustainable development needs is enormous, but only if our oceans can be restored and maintained to a healthy state. The Pacific Resilience Facility is a Pacific-led and owned initiative aimed at building resilience amongst our grassroots communities in the region, and particularly those disproportionately impacted by climate change, who are women and girls. Translating regional and international commitments into national gender-responsive climate change and disaster management policies and laws or practices has not been easy. However, Pacific Island countries are moving in this direction to ensure that gender-inclusive standards and practices are supporting women to lead climate change action. In Pacific communities, women have a history of adapting to climate change impacts to provide food and water for their families, often drawing on traditional and indigenous knowledge and practices. These need to be valued and supported to build and manage adaptation. Pacific disaster management processes are now more likely to be gender responsive, bringing a new acceptance and respect for women's roles in disasters and the transformation of social inclusion from a household to community responsibility. We are revitalizing the 2012 Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration. Significant challenges remain. Climate change and gender equality, climate change and related disasters disproportionately impact women, girls, indigenous persons, and persons with disability. Shifting rainfall patterns, salinity intrusions have substantial impacts on women in agriculture as women in some Pacific countries have restricted land ownership and limited access to resources. Women in the Pacific are highly dependent on marine and coastal resources for food security, but gender inequalities are still prevalent in fisheries resource management. Pacific has one of the highest rates of violence globally, where on average 2 out of every 3 women experience some form of violence throughout their life. Global evidence indicates a link between disasters, climate change, and gender-based violence. In the Pacific, we have seen increased reports of domestic violence cases and the need for psychosocial support after disasters, and those displaced by disasters are at the higher risk of gender-based violence than those who remain in their communities. Madam Chair, women already bear responsibility of unpaid care work. During disasters, they are subject to increased workloads and care responsibilities and must travel further to look for water, food. They are more exposed to non-communicable diseases. Access to sexual reproductive health and outreach services are worsened by climate change and related disasters. Protecting reproductive health rights for women and girls is fundamentally linked to building resilience to the impacts of climate change. Excellencies, we need ambitious, transformative, gender-responsive climate change action across all platforms to secure our collective future. We must pursue efforts to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. COVID-19 recovery and recovery from recurring natural disasters is an opportunity to reset our global development agenda to one that is climate resilient, gender inclusive, and leaves no one behind. We need more women, including global responses to climate change, to shape our global agenda for action. Excellencies, we echo the clear and urgent call of Pacific leaders for high ambition and action to take us away from code red back to a certain future for all humanity. The time for talk is well over. We need action. We need positive and sustainable change. We owe it to future generations. We owe it to the future of all women and girls. I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Fiji.